If there's one thing that Yu-Gi-Oh players like to do, it's complain. Now, I don't necessarily blame them because there are quite a few problems with this game right now. So even though we may have been playing for many years and we still enjoy the game in certain formats, I feel like the upcoming format is one of those that may not be as enjoyable. So in today's video, I just want to go over my thoughts on some of the other TCGs out there based on my own experience from playing them. So I'm going to be covering a few different aspects of each game, not teaching you how to play them, but rather as a Yu-Gi-Oh player first trying out those games, what I initially thought about it, what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, and how it sort of compares to Yu-Gi-Oh. So without any further ado, let's hop straight into it. For each of these card games, I'm going to be going over the cost, which is going to be the average cost of a tier 1 competitive deck, its complexity, so how complex is the game, how much room for outplaying your opponent there is, things of that nature. Pricing, pretty self-explanatory. If you go to a big tournament and you do well, how much can you expect to earn back? And finally, enjoyability. This is of course going to be the most subjective, but I'm going to be covering things I liked about the game and what I didn't like about the game. So starting off with Pokemon. Pokemon, I think its biggest appeal is that it's incredibly cheap to play at the tier 1 level. You can see here it's around $50 to $100 on average for a competitive tier 1 deck, and that might even be on closer to the high end. The way it works in Pokemon is most staple cards are printed in a low rarity, so it's very easily accessible for most players, and printed in a high rarity for those who want to max rarity out their deck. So if you're just looking to play competitively and don't care about rarity, most of the staple cards off the top of my head in the current competitive format are very affordable, aside from maybe like one, which is like $20 or $30, but compared to Yu-Gi-Oh, that's nothing. The thing with Pokemon as well is, even for cards that are somewhat expensive on release, so like maybe $20 or $30, Pokemon isn't afraid to reprint these cards a few months down the line in another core set. So even the most meta relevant cards that may sort of be expensive on release will become pretty cheap a few months later. So even if you're more of a budget player, you don't have to worry about that as well. And overall, I'd say the cost is probably the biggest thing Pokemon has going for it in my opinion, and it's definitely one big advantage that it has over Yu-Gi-Oh. Now, in terms of the complexity, I personally felt it wasn't a super complex game when I played it. I have played for a couple of months, and I felt that even as a completely new player going into the current competitive format, it was fairly easy to play at a competitive level. I think the biggest part was just knowing what potential cards each meta deck plays, and that's knowledge that you can gain just by looking up articles or watching videos online. There wasn't really too much crazy technical play in my opinion, aside from just making sure to manage your own board. In Pokemon, it's not really like Yu-Gi-Oh where you're constantly interacting with your opponent. Generally, your goal is to set up your own board and just execute your own game plan, and your opponent just sort of happens to be there. There are of course cards that interact with your opponent, but there's nothing like hand traps or trap cards. So I feel like for that reason, it's not a very complex game. So if that's not really your thing, I wouldn't recommend this game. Next up is pricing. I think pricing for Pokemon is incredibly good, even at more of a local level. Think of tournaments that are sort of like OTS championships, for example. These tournaments will give you like special promo cards, which are cool, but at the highest level, so like at the Pokemon equivalent of a YCS, they have cash prizes, and these cash prizes are really good. If you get top 32, I believe, you get like $1,000. First place, you get like $10,000, which is kind of crazy to think about coming from Yu-Gi-Oh. And that's not even mentioning that like Pokemon's top cut is only top 8, so you could get more from quote-unquote not even topping a Pokemon event just by getting top 32 than you would getting like first place at a Yu-Gi-Oh event, which is kind of crazy. So I'd say overall its price support definitely pretty good, at least when compared to Yu-Gi-Oh. It makes it definitely worthwhile to potentially grind this game competitively, because now you actually have a potential to make some money back and continue to support yourself playing this game. And then finally, enjoyability. I felt like it was maybe a little bit less enjoyable than Yu-Gi-Oh because I do enjoy Yu-Gi-Oh for its complexity and sort of like the back and forth and the different interactions that you can have. And I felt that with Pokemon, it was kind of hard to do that. There are going to be comebacks in Pokemon, and there are going to be cool plays you can make. But I felt like most of the time I was just trying not to misplay. And as long as I did that and my hand was a little better than my opponent's, I would just end up winning the game. So that's one thing I didn't really like about playing Pokemon. Another thing I didn't particularly like as well was that there are some floodgates still in the game. So it's not like Yu-Gi-Oh where you'll see something like Skill Drain, which will completely shut out every single deck out there, but these are more so targeted floodgates. So for example, if you think like Grave of the Sage Super Ancient Organism, if you're playing a deck that just happens to lose to that floodgate, you lose to it pretty hard, but not every deck's going to be affected by it. But I think the problem is the fact that these are still a thing, and just like in Yu-Gi-Oh, removal isn't always the most accessible in these decks since you don't have a side deck. I feel like that can cause some pretty unfun games. But outside of that, I felt like the game was fairly enjoyable. There usually is a very diverse meta, at least compared to Yu-Gi-Oh. There is obviously going to be a deck that's slightly above the rest, maybe the objective best deck, but there are always like 6, 7, 8 other decks that are able to compete with it in pretty much every single meta game I've seen so far. So I really feel like the format diversity is something I enjoy. Not to mention Pokemon also has a online simulator, which is pretty much just Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel, where it's easier to get those high rarity cards because you don't specifically need like ultra rare crafting points. You can just use their regular gems, and gems are super easy to get as long as you just play the game. So overall, I feel like Pokemon enjoyability, maybe a little bit less than Yu-Gi-Oh, but definitely can be very good if you just want to try out a new game that's pretty low risk and low investment, because if you end up not liking it, you didn't spend that much on it anyways. I felt like I had a pretty decent time, and the style of gameplay is quite different from Yu-Gi-Oh, so if you're looking for something completely new, then this is something you can check out. Next up is Magic the Gathering. So I don't have as much experience playing this game as I do with Pokemon, but from what I've seen so far, the cost of the deck is fairly high. For the most part, I'd say it's almost on par with Yu-Gi-Oh! But the thing with Magic is it has multiple different formats, and I haven't played all of them. From the research I've done, for most of the formats, the meta decks are going to be fairly expensive, so you can think about the cost as roughly the same as Yu-Gi-Oh! Next up is the complexity of the game, and from what I've seen so far, it is almost on par with Yu-Gi-Oh! There are interaction cards you can play on your opponent's turn, but there is like a mana system in this game. So that means like if you have, let's say, 5 quick play spells, you can't like necessarily play all of them on your opponent's turn at once like you could in Yu-Gi-Oh. You would have to have enough mana to be able to play them. You're not vomiting your hand out turn 1 as you are in Yu-Gi-Oh! And I feel that sort of a slower style of gameplay can be nice, because at least for me, I always felt like I had somewhat of a chance, even if my opponent had a better start than me or if I had a slower start. So overall, I'd say complexity wise, it's almost on par with Yu-Gi-Oh! There are quite a lot of cards and different interactions that you would need to think about when playing this game, because it does have that similar interactability with your opponent like Yu-Gi-Oh! Does. Next up is prizing. I also don't have the most experience with, and I know it depends on the format that you're playing. So if you're playing more of a casual format, the prizing might be like packs or whatever, but at the top level, they do offer cash prizes as well for their big tournaments. But the thing is, the cards are pretty expensive, so it does take a bigger upfront investment than something like Pokemon would. So if you want to go for those big prizes, you probably will need to spend a couple $100s on a competitive deck, at least to my knowledge. And finally, enjoyability. From what I've seen so far, the game was pretty fun to play. Like I mentioned, I really enjoyed sort of the slow ramping style, where you start off with like 1 mana, you can only play like smaller cards at first, and as the game goes on, you can play bigger and bigger and more powerful cards as you accumulate more mana. So I thought that was a pretty nice part of the game. Always felt like the games weren't necessarily over right away. For the most part, there are some things I didn't like though, and one that's, of course, being reliant on mana means there are going to be times where you're just stuck and you physically cannot play a card, and that is sort of unfortunate. So it does sort of have the same potential issue where you can brick in Yu-Gi-Oh! And just can't play the game. But the thing about Magic is it does have a mulligan system where you're able to mulligan your hand up to 7 times at the start of a game, and then you can use it to like sculpt your hand. You will just have to put like a card back to the bottom of your deck for every time you mulligan. But that does mean you aren't going to get as many games as Yu-Gi-Oh! Where you just open your hand, can't play, and just sort of auto lose. So even though it does have that mana system which can cause you to brick, I do like that mulligan feature, meaning there's going to be less games where you just can't do anything at all. There are, of course, some cards that are a little bit unfair in Magic. From my experience, just to name an example, there was a card that just literally gives you an extra turn. Of course, it's not the easiest thing to pull off, but I did have that played against me. But overall, I would say from my little experience playing this game, it has been almost at the level of Yu-Gi-Oh! In terms of complexity and enjoyability. If you have sort of a bigger budget and you want to give another game a try, I'd say Magic is probably a great one. If you end up not liking one format, you can try another format as well. And I know that the different formats cater to like different styles of play. Next up is Lorcana. So Lorcana, like Magic, I also haven't played the most, but from the bit I have played, the cost for the decks is pretty expensive. It is almost on the level of Yu-Gi-Oh for a tier 1 deck, but I will say this with an asterisk because this game is still fairly new. They might add like more reprint sets, or they just might make cards more accessible, things like that. Take that with a grain of salt right now, but at least at the moment, it is fairly expensive to get into this game at a tier 1 level. There are of course budget decks, but most of the best decks do cost a couple $100, similar to Yu-Gi-Oh. Next up is complexity. I think complexity, it's a little bit more complex than Pokemon, but roughly on the same level. There aren't that many cards in the card pool right now, and there isn't interaction on your opponent's turn, so like no trap cards or anything. It's sort of just monsters and normal spells right now. That makes it so the game is fairly easy to pick up. You don't have to think about, I would say maybe one extra layer of complexity this game has over Pokemon is you have to decide whether it's worth hitting your opponent's monster or just hitting their face directly to get you closer to your win condition. In terms of pricing, I put an asterisk over this one because once again, it is a fairly new game. They might add more pricing in the future. They might change the pricing structure. But also, from the research I did, you do get promo cards just for playing, I believe. And these promo cards can be worth quite a lot. But I don't know if that's going to continue in the future. So that's why I'm just going to tentatively say the pricing is pretty good. But once again, this is a new game, so who knows where it's going to go in the future. And then finally, enjoyability. I did really like playing this game. It was quite a nice change from Yu-Gi-Oh in the sense, like once again, it has sort of like a mana system like Magic. There is going to be that slow ramping over the game. That's going to mean the games are going to go on a little bit longer and it feels like you always have a chance. I think I also just found it really funny that I could play these like Disney characters and have these like goofy songs when I'm playing the game. But some things I guess I didn't like about it. It did also sort of feel like once your opponent really got going, there was pretty much nothing you can do about it at some points. If your opponent just had a really hot start, or if you had a bit of a slower start, your opponent's deck could just ramp up a lot faster than yours, and you really don't have any cards that could really help you come back at that point because your opponent's just generated so much card advantage so far ahead. Of course, that's going to happen in all card games, but I felt like it happened in this card game a little bit more often than some of the other ones I've tried. But outside of that, I felt like it was a fairly nice style of gameplay, pretty simplistic, easy to learn. So I definitely say if you have a bit of a bigger budget and want to give this a try, then it should be worth taking a look at least. I don't believe it has an online simulator yet, and that's something I forgot to mention for Magic as well, but Magic does have an online simulator as far as I know, and the way you get cards on there is fairly accessible, I guess. But Lorcana doesn't really have an online simulator at the moment, so if you do want to play, you probably will have to shell out the money to play IRL. And then the last TCG I'm going to talk about is Elestrals. Elestrals is the newest TCG on this list, and some of you may not have even heard about it before, but I guess the best way I can describe it is like a combination of the best parts of Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon. This is in a similar spot as Lorcana in terms of its complexity. You just have like monsters and basic back row cards, so think cards like or Smashing Ground in Yu-Gi-Oh! So the power level of the cards right now is fairly low, and I would say it's comparable to like 2006, 2008 Yu-Gi-Oh! Roughly around that. Like play your monsters, protect them with back row, call it a day. It's not a very complex game at all and pretty easy to learn. The cost of the cards I put question mark because it is a new game and I don't even think they have distributed their cards to all the game stores yet. So I think the only way right now to get the cards is directly from the manufacturer, and for that reason I just didn't want to comment on the price of the cards because that might change in the future. But I will say that they have printed like key staple cards in their basic starter decks and structure decks, so I don't foresee the cards being too expensive, especially if you're just trying to play at a low rarity, because I think that's something the creator of the game wanted to make sure everyone could have access to like the most competitive cards. I think that's great, so I don't expect the cost to be very high. Once it does get distributed to all the game stores, it'd probably be roughly the same level as Pokemon if I were to guess. Same thing with pricing. They do have a few big tournaments right now. Like the game is not very accessible to many people, so their structure may just change in the future once they have bigger tournaments. Right now, I know that you get like some regular pricing, probably like packs or whatever. If you win like their special tournament, you get like a card that was designed like after you, which is kind of cool. But once again, I don't know where this is going to go in the future once the game becomes bigger, and it may be subject to change, so I can't really comment too much on it right now. When I tried playing this game, it was fairly enjoyable. It almost felt like GOAT format in Yu-Gi-Oh! Summon your monster has like one nice effect that's pretty good standalone, then you just back it up with like a couple of spells and traps that can protect the monster. Nice slower pace, but if that's not really your thing, then you probably wouldn't enjoy this game, because at least at the moment, there isn't that much like crazy complexity between like card interactions and crazy combos for the most part. I do also think that Elestrals has a pretty good mulligan system to make it so you can mulligan as many times as you want. You just lose a bit of life every time you mulligan, but that just makes it so there aren't going to be that many games where you just absolutely can't do anything at all or are stuck with a bad hand that you don't want. They also have an online simulator that's in development at the moment, so I foresee that it'll probably be something like Master Duel. And as far as I know, you actually get all the cards to begin with, so you don't even need to go through the gambling process like you would in Master Duel or anything like that. So that'd be pretty nice if that's correct. But yeah, overall I felt like it was a nice change of pace from Yu-Gi-Oh! If you're looking for something slower, then this can definitely be the card game for you. I do also want to say a big thank you to the team at Elestrals for sending me a influencer package. You'll see it in the background right now where I'm able to open a couple of their packs just to show you how some of the cards look, because I think one great thing about this game is its artwork. A lot of the artwork is pretty unique. It's loosely based off of Greek mythology, I think, which is kind of cool. And if you enjoy like just pretty cards, then this is also something that I feel like could appeal to you. I'm just gonna be playing the opening in the background so you can sort of get an idea of what some of the cards would do and how some of the cards look like. This is not sponsored or anything. They're not paying me to say this about the game, but I did feel like the way the packs are set up are nice. It seems like the staple cards that you would need in every deck aren't like the craziest difficult to get like in some other games. That's gonna do it for the video. Let me know what you guys think about these other card games. If you've had experience with them, let me know what you think about playing them. I know this is a different style of video than I normally do, but I feel like with the format we're about to enter, it was pretty fitting to talk about some of the other potential options if you wanted to take a break from Yu-Gi-Oh! Once again, this was just my opinion and my own experience with the game, so yours might be completely different, so do take everything I say with a grain of salt. Plus, I haven't played every single popular TCG out there. I know there are a lot of other ones that people might have had great experiences with. So if you have had a good experience with another card game or a bad experience with one, do put it in the comment section below. I do read all your comments. I just don't necessarily have the time to respond to them all. But with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.